First tonight, we look at a controversial new Justice Department plan to combat organized crime. As we reported earlier, Attorney General Dick Thornburgh wants to end the independent operations of the Justice Department's 14 organized crime strike forces. The Attorney General wants to merge those anti-mob units with U.S. attorneys' offices around the country. But his plan has met with considerable opposition from many in the law enforcement community and on Capitol Hill. Correspondent Kwame Holman has a background report.
It was more than 50 years ago that the federal government began targeting organized crime in earnest. A young J. Edgar Hoover and his brand new FBI became national heroes while pursuing notorious gangsters of the 30s like John Dillinger and Al Capone. In the decades that followed, priorities shifted away from organized crime. Some criticized Hoover for not making a serious effort to break up the mafia. But whatever the reason, gangbusting had a low priority in the 1940s and 50s. Law enforcement's current approach to organized crime got started about 30 years ago. Some say it began with the frustration that young Robert Kennedy felt as chief counsel for the Senate committee investigating labor unions like the Teamsters and reputed mob figures like Antonio Corrallo.
You're also known as Duck Corrallo.
I refuse to answer on the grounds of main intent to
You
criminate.
got any business?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of intent to criminate.
You have any profession?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of main intent
You have
to
any
criminate.
occupation?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of main intent
Are
to
you a
criminate.
known racketeer?
I refuse to answer on the grounds of main intent to criminate me.
You have a lawyer?
Yes, sir.
So when Robert Kennedy became Attorney General in 1961, he took a new approach. Instead of fighting organized crime through the U.S. attorneys in offices around the country, he picked a few Justice Department lawyers from Washington and assigned them to do sustained work on specific organized crime and corruption cases in different parts of the country. The U.S. attorneys in their local offices were bypassed entirely. Everyone agrees that the past few years have been bad news for the mob. In Boston, for example, the Angiulo case, which took most of a decade to develop, convicted the entire leadership of one organized crime family in 1986. In Philadelphia, Nicodemo Scarfo and 16 associates were convicted on similar charges in 1988. And in New York, the same Tony Ducks Corrallo, who once took the Fifth Amendment on Capitol Hill, received a 100-year prison sentence in 1987 for being a member of the so-called Mafia Commission. The government said it was a kind of nationwide board of directors of organized crime. But in spite of all the successful prosecutions, some critics wonder how much the strike forces had to do with it all. Some cases, like the Angiulo and Scarfo cases, were developed by local strike forces. But the New York Commission case wasn't. Neither was the important Pizza Connection case, which linked American and Sicilian mobsters in a complex drug smuggling scheme that operated through pizza parlors. Both of those cases were developed through the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, who for most of that time was Rudolph Giuliani. His office hasn't had a strike force for a decade. In fact, it was Dick Thornburgh who, as Deputy Attorney General 10 years ago, dismantled the New York strike force. Today, Thornburgh heads the entire Justice Department, and he hasn't changed his views.
The guidelines, the meetings, the reports, the consultations are all a byproduct of a bifurcated law enforcement effort which has proven to be counterproductive over the years. I want less in the way of reports, less in the way of guidelines, less in the way of meetings and consultations and committees, and more in the way of action out of a unified anti-organized crime effort. An end to turf battles is at the very heart of what this president has directed this Attorney General to do. And that is what is at the heart of the proposal that we're making. You can't have turf battles when there's only one turf. And that's what we would have with the consolidation proposal that I presented.
Joining us now to debate the new plan are Robert Bonner, a former U.S. attorney in Los Angeles, where he is now a federal judge, and Edward Mcdonald, former attorney in charge of the organized crime strike force for Brooklyn, New York, a post he held from June 1982 until June of this year. He is now in private practice. And going to you first, Judge Bonner, is that at the heart of it, the turf wars? Or are there other things that convince you that the Attorney General is on the right track?
Well, that's certainly a part of it, Charlene, that there have been historic tensions and a lot of time, energy, and effort spent on turf battles between the strike force on the one hand and the U.S. Attorney's Office on the other. But it's important to understand that the Attorney General's proposal is not to dismantle or eliminate the strike forces. The proposal of Attorney General Thornburg is to merge and incorporate these strike forces within the United States Attorney's offices. These would be the offices, the larger U.S. Attorney's offices like Los Angeles, Chicago, and so on, which I think have a demonstrated track record, these U.S. Attorney's offices, of being able to handle and develop the most difficult, long-term, sophisticated kinds of federal criminal cases.
Well, what's wrong with that, Mr. McDonald?
Well, I think you first have to look at the success record of the strike forces in the last 15 years. In every city in this country where there's a high incidence of organized crime, the strike forces in those cities have been responsible for dismantling the leadership of organized crime. Not only that, but the organized crime strike forces in those cities were in the forefront of bringing very, very controversial prosecutions against significant labor racketeers, significant public officials and politicians, and significant businessmen, people who were very, very powerful in their communities. And this, I think, resulted in a great deal of clamor and opposition within those communities among powerful people with politicians against the strike force. In view of the success record, I just simply think it doesn't make any sense at all to dismantle the strike forces.
But he's saying that they're not being dismantled, they're being merged within the Justice Department into a much more unified entity.
This merger is really a euphemism for the abolition of the strike force. Today, in the Brooklyn strike force, 6 of my former colleagues resigned rather than working for the United States Attorney's Office. The program simply would not work, in my view. I think that what would be forfeited would be a number of things. First of all, national coordination from the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section in Washington, which for the last 20 years has been responsible for administering the organized crime program through the strike force units throughout the country. The United States attorneys are presidential appointees who have proven themselves to be far more independent than strike force chiefs and would carry out their own independent, localized, regional agendas rather than carrying out a national organized crime program.
And you think that would be to the detriment of the effort?
There's no question it would be to the detriment of the effort.
Let me just get Judge Bonner. That was quite a mouthful. Judge Bonner, you're a judge. You're used to listening to a lot of different things. Let me get you to respond to some of the things that Mr. McDonald just said.
Well, first of all, I don't think it's accurate to say that that there is going to be a dismantlement of the strike forces. The fact is that the most successful organized crime cases, the most important, brought in the history of this country, were brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York, which was the only office into which a strike force was merged and became a strike force organized crime unit within a U.S. Attorney's Office. That's resulted in, as the opening piece indicated, the Mafia Commission case, the Pizza Connection case, and these were cases that were developed over a considerable period of years and during the tenure of several U.S. attorneys in the Southern District of New York. So the one example we have of a merged strike force has been highly successful.
It's much more successful than if they were operating alone, you think?
Yes, because operating separate and apart from the U.S. attorney's offices, you have the difficulty, really a definitional difficulty, of what is an organized crime case. What qualifies? What kind of case should be handled by the strike force as opposed to the U.S. attorney and U.S. attorney's office? And this has been a continual problem since the creation of these strike forces 20 years ago. This will be eliminated. But not only that, you'll have an additional benefit, and that is by incorporating these strike forces within the U.S. attorney's offices, you will be adding the considerable strengths and expertise and demonstrated track record of U.S. attorney's offices to handle these cases. So you're going to strengthen and revitalize the Department of Justice's efforts to attack and root out organized crime in this country.
What's wrong with that, Mr. McDonald?
I'd like to address myself to the comments about the United States Attorney's Office in the Southern District of New York. The strike force in the Southern District was merged into the U.S. Attorney's Office in 1976. For the first 7 years of that merger, the track record in battling organized crime cases was virtually non-existent. The head of the unit in 1980, in a memo to Washington, freely acknowledged that the Southern District had been ineffectual and unproductive in bringing organized crime cases. It wasn't until 1983, when Rudolph Giuliani became U.S. Attorney, that office in the Southern District began to focus its attention on organized crime cases, and we saw the successes which were achieved by Mr. Giuliani. By 1986, after Mr. Giuliani, who is now running for mayor in this city, received much acclaim and publicity for his successes in organized crime, he focused his attention on other areas. In 1986, there were approximately 25 assistants assigned to the organized crime unit in that office. Today, with that office focusing on public corruption cases and business crimes such as insider trading cases, we see 7 or 8 relatively inexperienced assistants fighting the organized crime problems in New York. At the same time, the organized crime strike forces throughout the country have maintained a continuous commitment to the organized crime problem.
So you're saying that was an aberration in the total
It's
scheme
exactly
of
what
things.
it was an aberration.
Let me just go back to you, Judge Bonner, and get you to respond to the to what Mr. McDonald said earlier, that this is all partly political because the strike forces brought so much heat in local jurisdictions. And also, there's another political dimension that that these people are much more subject to political pressure than the strike forces, the U.S. attorneys. How do you respond to that?
Well, that's just absolutely untrue. I mean, we've had a remarkable record of talented, able United States attorneys in this country who have been independent of political influence or any other kind of influence. And I think that record speaks for itself. And quite frankly, I think the suggestion otherwise is somewhat disingenuous. The record, first of all, U.S. attorneys and U.S. attorneys' offices right now prosecute virtually all of the public corruption cases that are prosecuted by the Department of Justice. They prosecute all of the major white-collar crime cases, securities fraud cases, defense procurement fraud cases. They're entrusted with an enormous responsibility as it is. The problem is that you have, by creation of a separate field office in Los Angeles or Chicago or wherever it is, you have a management structure that doesn't make any sense. And all the Attorney General is proposing is a management structure where you don't have 2 field offices of the Department of Justice in competition with each other, fighting turf wars, wasting time, where the Attorney General can look to one person in the field, and that is the United States Attorney, for accountability for what's being done with respect to the organized crime problem and how it's approached. That isn't the case now, and that's something that the Attorney General, who, quite frankly, more than any other Attorney General we've ever had, has an understanding of the organization of the Department of Justice. He's looked at this, and he's proposed that this reorganization will strengthen the department's organized crime effort rather than weaken it.
Mr. McDonald, what about the argument that's made by the Attorney General and others that these strike forces have been slow to respond to changes in organized crime? That they might have done all right with the mob and everything, but they're just not with it in terms of trying to fight the new drug trafficking cartels and so on. What's your response to that?
There's no question that the organized crime section would be with it. The only reason that the organized crime section and the strike forces are not in the fight against the emerging organized crime groups with both feet is because the United States Attorneys Conference has simply opposed that every step of the way. The organized crime section has been fighting since the early 1980s to get involved with in battling the emerging organized crime groups, and the United States attorneys, through their influence, have been able to impede the section's ability to do that.
Well, that sounds like the turf war that Mr. Thornburg, Attorney General Thornburg, says he's trying to eliminate. I mean, wouldn't that get straightened out in that way?
That's on a policy level. I mean, when they're talking about turf battles, they're talking about localized turf battles between United States attorneys and strike force chiefs in cities over particular cases. I was in the strike force for over 11 years, and in my experience, we had very, very few turf wars with United States attorneys. The current United States attorney in Brooklyn was someone who was very much opposed to the strike force concept. Nonetheless, I got along very, very well with him, and it was a pleasure to work with him.
Judge Bonner, let me ask you this. How do you account for the fact you heard Senator Kennedy make his case saying that this was about the egos of U.S. attorneys, but there's a wide array of congressional types ranging all the way from Senator Kennedy on the left over to Strom Thurmond on the right, who are opposed to eliminating the strike forces. If they're so bad, why do you have this kind of array of people supporting them, saying if it ain't broke, don't fix it in the Congress?
I'm not sure all of the people, the senators you've named, are opposed to the reorganization that the Attorney General is proposing. But I do think that there is, perhaps even in Congress, a lack of fundamental understanding of the department's organization. After all, the United States Attorney's Office for 200 years now have been the principal field offices, the litigating arm for prosecuting federal cases of the Department of Justice. That's been the structure of the department. It's worked very well for us. And the strike forces really are an aberration. They're an anomaly. And I think that it's time, as the Attorney General suggested, that we correct it.
Mr. Mcdonald, what's going to happen if the strike forces are merged? I mean, in terms of this huge new war on drugs and the continued influence of organized crime in American life, what do you think is going to happen if we lose the strike forces, or if they are merged, as Mr. Bonner prefers to say, within the Justice Department?
Well, in the short run, I think you're going to see many, or not most, of the career prosecutors who have worked in the strike force program for 10, 15, or 20 years leaving. That's my experience in Brooklyn. We had 15 attorneys working there in May when this program, when this merger, so-called merger, was announced. By the end of the year, there will probably be only 1 or 2 people working in the merged unit in the United States Attorney's Office. So in the short run, we'll have disastrous consequences when we'll have inexperienced assistant U.S. attorneys getting on-the-job training.
Disastrous consequences, you mean what?
Disastrous consequences in that major organized crime cases will not be brought, or if they will be brought, they'll be brought after a period of on-the-job training where inexperienced assistants are learning about the inner workings of organized crime and labor racketeering. In the long run, I think you're going to see the United States attorneys with their regional priorities and their localized commitments, and you have to remember, United States attorneys for the most part stay in office for very short periods of time, and they're going to be, many of them are political appointees and people who are looking to have political careers for themselves, and during the course of their terms, they're going to be looking for the quick hits, the quick headlines. Why make a case? Why devote resources to a long-term investigation that's going to come to fruition after the U.S. attorney leaves office?
Mr. Bonner, Judge Bonner, please respond to that and say what you think will happen if the...
Very quickly, let me just say that in the nearly 6 years I was United States Attorney in Los Angeles, I had 3 strike force chiefs. Not one, but every couple of years there was a strike force chief replaced, so there isn't that much continuity in the strike force. As far as the experience, assistant U.S. attorneys, federal prosecutors in U.S. attorneys' offices are significantly more experienced and stay longer with the government than strike force attorneys. The 4 or 5 strike force attorneys in Los Angeles, for example, have under 2 years experience as federal prosecutors, whereas the U.S. Attorney's Office there and around the country have many, many more experienced federal prosecutors than the strike force offices. So I don't think there's going to be any disaster. I think that the whole effort against organized crime by the Department of Justice is going to be enhanced and improved by this merger.
Well, we hope you're right, Judge Bonner. Thank you for being with us, and Mr. Mcdonald, thank you.
Thank you.